Good morning, tea break. Welcome to the current session, which is Rethinking Risk, New Issues and Dilemmas in Risk Assessment, which will be a topic both familiar and dear to the hearts of many of you in the room. We're delighted to have a really exciting panel of presenters for this session, including three people who are joining us online from various locations overseas, as well as Dr. Emma Belton, who of course will be with us here in person. So just a couple of things. I will be, for those speakers, pardon me, who are online, I will be indicating verbally, so please don't think of it as an interruption. I'll be indicating verbally 5 minutes, 1 minute, and then out of time, should you need an out of time reminder. But I'll be holding up a little sign for Emma because she'll be able to physically see me. So I would like to introduce, without further ado, our very first speaker, and that is Astrid Bastiaens from Maastricht University, who is going to be speaking to us about Beyond Extremism, Radicalization and Risk Factors, a review on the use of risk assessment instruments for terrorism and a proposed focus on behavioural indicators. A warm welcome to you, Astrid, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. All right, I will first try to share this here. Let's have a look and then get you back somehow. Okay, I think this will have to do. Or, there you are. Great. Can you see my slides well?
Yeah, everything's good.
Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the very kind introduction and for having me here at this great symposium. So I'm Astrid Bastiaens, and I'm a forensic psychologist by background, and my PhD research is on terrorism threat detection. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about the first findings of my PhD research, because for the past 1.5 years, I have mainly conducted literature research into the risk and threat assessment instruments we have for terrorism and their validity. What really struck me when I started reading the current literature and best practices is how much these instruments and our prevention approaches still depend on perpetrator characteristics and on measuring the extent of radicalization. However, attempts at establishing a terrorist attacker profile have been mostly unsuccessful, so these characteristics are also not very informative in trying to detect those who would be planning an attack. In his recent book, John Horgan has shortly talked about this, and I would like to share two statements with you because they really spoke to me. The first one is, no amount of theorizing on radicalization brings us closer to understanding the reality of how a person learns to take another person's life. And the second one is, identifying common themes among terrorists does not allow us to predict with any confidence who is more likely to become involved in terrorism. I find these quotes so bold and interesting because even though we all know and agree that not all radicals become terrorists and not all all terrorist attackers are not that radicalized, we still try to predict who will commit terrorist violence based on who is most radicalized. So it's very important in our prevention efforts that we specify what this method or this instrument is actually trying to prevent. So for this reason, I would like to discuss a little bit more what some of the greats in our field have been advocating for decades, that it is imperative to clearly specify what this method or this instrument is actually trying to prevent. And for this reason, some scholars have brilliantly proposed to distinguish between cognitive and behavioral radicalization, or between radical attitudes and radical action, so we can specify better which part of radicalization we are focusing on. So think about the two-tier pyramids model here, for example, or the more recent ABC model by Cullen and Horgan. So cognitive radicalization is where you adopt radical ideas and beliefs, and behavioral radicalization is where you're going to start taking actions in support of your beliefs. For example, going to protests, volunteering, or even recruiting for a radical organization. We would like to extrapolate this distinction to extremism too. So the difference that has been kind of proposed between radicalization and extremism is that radicalization is more the adoption of radical ideas, not necessarily harmful to others or to society, whereas extremism is accepting and supporting the use of violence for extreme ideas. So then you'd get cognitive extremism, where you adopt extreme attitudes that would include that it's a good thing when someone else uses violence to advocate for these attitudes. And there's behavioral extremism, where you would take these kind of actions yourself. Again, that can be just lending someone some money so they can buy a gun, so actions that support violence, but it could also be getting a gun yourself and using it to start shooting people. So there's really such a range of actions and passivity included when we talk about radicalization and extremism and preventing these. And currently, prevention methods are focused on all 4 of these parts of the table. But if we want to detect terrorist attacks that are being planned, we'll have to be more specific in our prevention efforts, especially because interviews with terrorist offenders have found that their cognitive and behavioral radicalization and extremism did not evolve together. So for some, cognitive radicalization and extremism was strongest first, and for some, it was the behavioral aspects that evolved first. So they first become involved in a group, maybe even committing violence for them, before the radical attitudes would really develop. And for others, only one of them was fully present and the other never really developed fully. So trying to predict or reduce one half of this table based on the other half of the table simply wouldn't work. In addition, the characteristics of terrorism perpetrators and the ways in which people radicalize are changing, as this conference is all about. And that has large implications for prevention, as prevention efforts are based on these. So as a topic of the symposium and its very diverse program shows, terrorism is changing. The characteristics of the people that do terrorism have changed, their backgrounds have changed, and the environments where they develop their extreme and violent ideas has changed. For example, even though studies attempting to define a terrorist offender profile have mostly been unsuccessful, they did find quite consistently that terrorist offenders are young adult males. But just a quick look at some of the terrorist attacks that occurred in the past 5 years shows us that this is not true anymore. Now, many 40, 50, and 60-year-olds are also committing violent terrorist attacks. Similarly, a look at the symposium program tells us that children as young as 7 are also being targeted to become cognitively radicalized. So what kind of danger can we expect from these kids when they appear on our radar, when they display the same risk factors? Because wouldn't cognitive radicalization and the way that this is expressed be different in children of 10-year-olds or in seniors compared to a 20-year-old? But also the backgrounds of terrorist attackers have changed in the past years, where we used to look mostly in urban environments to detect those that were planning a terrorist attack. We can see now that recent terrorist attacks have also been committed by people from a more rural, more isolated background. This, of course, had an impact on the way in which we try to intercept these people and the security forces and departments that need to be involved. But possibly the most drastic change has occurred in the environments in which people develop extremist ideas. We already had a small panic in the field when the internet and later social media started playing a role in radicalization processes. Examples of more recent changes in the platforms for radicalized content are abundant in this symposium program. So radical views are being presented in novels and are being talked about in online gaming communities. Research has also shown that you can train generative AI to respond to you with radical and extremist beliefs. So observing that someone is now adhering to these radical views or that they're talking to other people who hold these radical views has become much more difficult. What does not change, however, is that for committing an attack, these perpetrators will need some kind of weapon, usually an explosive or a firearm or a vehicle. So what hasn't changed is that they need to somehow acquire or build this weapon, that they sometimes talk about these attacks to outsiders. So what hasn't changed is the fact that these attacks are proactive violence, that they're usually planned over long periods of time. So actually, a lot of these attackers will display behavioral warning signals in the months before their attack. And these are also called leaking signals, not to be confused with leakage signals. So leakage is when you tell someone directly that you're planning an attack, either through threats or disclosing your plans. But leaking is more comprehensive because it also includes other observable warning signals, such as purchasing weapons or making vague threats on social media. And it turns out that a lot of the attackers send out these kind of leaking signals. And individually, they might not tell you that much about the threat someone poses for committing an attack. But if you bring them together and assess their strengths, they give you a surprisingly good indication whether someone is currently planning an attack or not. And that is exactly what Latrin-IT, a recently developed threat assessment instrument from Germany, attempts to do. It looks at all the leaking signals someone has shown, and based on the frequency and the characteristics, it gives you an estimation whether this person is currently planning an attack or not. And the first studies have shown that it is quite accurate at this. So full disclosure, the project started as a joint project for terrorist violence from all ideologies, but analyses showed that certain leaking signals were differently relevant for different ideologies. So the instrument that I will continue to talk about is specifically aimed at those within Islam's motivation, but a similar instrument was created for right-wing terrorism too, and I'm sure the principle would work for terrorist attacks with a different motivation too. So the development of the instrument was done by two German researchers, Laura Tampe and Rebecca Bondo, and they used prosecution files of 48 offenders who were actually convicted of planning or committing a terrorist attack, and 52 individuals who had been suspected of planning an attack and had shown leaking, but who were actually innocent. So coders read through the files and noted whether certain leaking signals, such as talking to family members about intentions for an attack or attempting to purchase a weapon, whether those were present. 96% of those who had actually planned or committed an attack had shown leaking signals. On average, 12 leaking signals per perpetrator could be identified, and these occurred on average over a time span of 12 months before the attack. So in comparison, those who were innocent showed an average of 3 leakings. So there was a really big difference there. Data analysis showed that 16 criteria were especially adept at distinguishing actual leaking signals from false leaking. So these were used for constructing the instrument. And after the instrument was constructed, it was also tested on its predictive validity of categorizing the cases in the correct group. So for the statistics enthusiasts under us, guilty as charged, these analyses showed that the tool reached an area under the curve of 0.91, with a sensitivity of 92% and a specificity of 65% for a cutoff value at a moderate risk category. That means that for people who were guilty of planning or committing an attack, the tool could detect that in 92% of the cases. And it could detect innocence in 65% of the cases. So for deciding that someone should not be investigated anymore, the tool could still benefit from a bit higher accuracy, but it's performing really, really well at picking out the cases where imminent intervention is needed. So these are great, promising results. But of course, they are based on the cases with which the instrument was constructed. So the researchers decided to also test their tool with cases that had not been included in this original dataset. Of course, and fortunately, there has been a limited amount of terrorist attacks in Germany in the past 2 decades, so the sample for this study was a little bit smaller. It included 18 perpetrators and 12 individuals in the comparison group. Again, the cases were coded on the instrument and it was analyzed how well the tool post-dicted the actual events. And the researchers did need to rely on publicly available documents for scoring the perpetrator sample in the study. So overall, the reliability of the study is expected to be a little bit lower than the original study. But even then, the results remained very promising with an area under the curve of 0.85. The sensitivity remained very high with 94%, and the specificity decreased a little bit to 58% for a cutoff at high risk. So overall, this study confirms that letter and id might be a valuable addition to our toolkit of prevention efforts, and at least that it deserves further validation. And that's exactly what I would like to do in my PhD research. So the validation of risk and threat assessment tools in our field is really a rare occurrence, but it's so important. And in my PhD project, I can offer an independent evaluation of this tool because I want to test whether it would work in other countries and settings too. And I really think this instrument could provide groundbreaking accuracy to our prevention efforts, and that this research is really, really important. So we're hoping to gather case files where the ground truth is known of both innocent suspects and those who were planning an attack, and then see whether the instrument can retrospectively detect those who did have real plans. So if you would have any tips regarding gathering case files, or if you would like to share case files, or anything else, I would be very happy to hear about that. Yeah, so I think that's it for me. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to any questions or comments later in the discussion.
Okay, thank you so much, Astrid. That was beautifully timed. You've actually come in a little bit early, which is always music to the ears of a session chair. So yes, please do stay on the line. And of course, we will be having questions for all our panelists at the end of the presentations. So our next presenter is Dr. Bettina Rottweiler. Welcome back, Bettina. Lovely to see you again today. Bettina is from the University College London, and in this session, she is going to be speaking to us about moving from discrimination to grievance-fuelled violence. When and for whom do perceived threats increase risk toward engagement in anti-Muslim behaviors and violence? And Bettina, just quickly before you start, can you actually see me from where you are?
Yeah, can see you.
You can. Good. Okay. All right. Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Right. So hi, everyone. Nice to be back. As I mentioned yesterday, I have actually just moved to the US, so that's wrong on the slides. I'm not based at University College London anymore. I just moved to Insight and working on several projects here with them. So just to update you, today I'm going to speak about a study which I have been conducting with several of my co-authors. The data collection and the study was led by Matteo Vergani, also Caitlin Clemmo and Noemi Buana from UCL are involved, and also Carrie O'Brien. And yeah, so the data was collected by Matteo, and then I ran the analyses, and all authors were involved in the write-up. And really what we wanted to do here is look at different types of grievances and when and for whom certain types of grievances, such as perceived threats, might increase risk towards violence against Muslims. So grievance-fuelled violence has been described as violence driven by anger, frustration, or resentment because of perceived injustice or mistreatment. And the concept of grievance-fuelled violence really proposes that a common motivation for violence can be rooted either in personal or public grievances. And we know that perceived threats from an outgroup is a common grievance prevalent across different types of targeted violence. We've also seen that rising immigration and demographic changes across Western countries have not only resulted in anti-immigration sentiments and political polarization, but they also have motivated violent attacks against Muslims, but also other immigrants in Western countries. We've also seen that rhetoric relating to the white race and extinction or the potential extinctions of the white race from immigrants, and particularly from Muslims, is prevalent within far-right extremist circles, but also really has been shown or has been featured amongst the mainstream. And we've also seen that within terrorist manifestos, terrorist attacks, these things have been mentioned regularly. So when we actually look at risk factors for different types of violent extremism, targeted violence, grievance-fuelled violence, we know that risk factors are really complex. There is usually a host of risk factors involved. It's usually not just one factor which can explain why someone radicalizes or why someone engages in violence. And we also know certain people share a lot of risk factors, and then in the end they do not engage in violence. So for us it was really like, how can we get at least one step closer to understanding who might be more likely to engage in violence. And we also know that all these factors, they usually don't operate independently, they usually interact with each other. So it's usually an interaction of factors at multiple levels of analysis. I'll explain you more about this later, but we are using a conceptual framework developed by Noemi Buana, or we use a part of it. And here we're looking at interactions of different factors at individual and situational level. And that leads me to the next slide. So our conceptual framework conceives of threat perception as an indicator for motivation. And depending on whether certain other factors are present or not, when threat perceptions are present, we might see a higher or lesser likelihood towards engagement in violence. So we know that threat perception have been a risk factor for different types of violence, targeted violence, grievance-fuelled violence, but we also know that the majority of those individuals who do have certain threat perceptions would never engage in violence. So it's really kind of teasing out these factors which might amplify or dampen the effects. And we were really interested to see who might be more vulnerable, who might be less vulnerable. And also for practice, this is really important because certain factors might be, could potentially be integrated in intervention and prevention programs. So we're using, as I said, a part. We couldn't operationalize everything, but we use a part of a risk analysis framework, which was developed, parts of it was developed by Noemi Buana, and then Caitlin further developed it. And we're using that as our conceptual and analytical framework. And really what the risk analysis framework does, it organizes key relations among causal factors and processes involved in the vulnerability to criminal action at multiple levels of analysis. So it doesn't just look at the individual level, but it also includes other levels. And then the first domain is propensity. And here the main factor is cognitive susceptibility to moral change. So this can, for example, include individuals' pre-existing disposition to moral rule breaking, but also their executive functioning capacity, such as their impulsivity and thrill seeking. I've spoken a bit about this yesterday already. And we've seen across our data, but also across other studies, that these factors are usually heavily involved in the development of violent and criminal propensities, not just when we look at targeted violence or violent extremism, but general violence as well. Then the second domain is the situational domain, which addresses people's lifestyles, preferences, habits, and also certain activity fields. I think Noemi has spoken yesterday about it, which might increase someone's risk of selection and someone's exposure to certain settings, which might have violent supportive features and affordances to people. And here we look at situational stressors in people's life, but also proximal or recent crises. And then lastly, we look also at the exposure domain, and that is really related to people, places, and materials where or in which susceptible individuals might be exposed to radicalizing contents. So there could be contact with or attachment to influential agents, but it can also be via exposure to violent, supportive moral norms and rules. And so specifically what we wanted to do here, we wanted to see when and for whom a grievance, here in our specific case, threat perceptions, might interact with these risk domains in order to increase violent intentions to engage in violent behaviors towards Muslims. And in order to do this, we ran several interaction models where we looked at the interaction between threat perception and each of the individual risk domains. And we looked at, as I said, propensity, situation, and exposure-related domains. And we really wanted to see for whom these threat perceptions might have particularly adverse effects. And in order to operationalize the risk domain, so for the propensity one, we looked at 4 different factors. 2 I actually mentioned yesterday already, just because they heavily feature within our research. That is legal cynicism. So it's like you think it's okay to break the rules, norms, and law. Then also low self-control, social alienation, and as well as people's self-reported criminal and violent propensities. Then the situational domain was operationalized with measuring people's proximal crises. So we asked them about different recent stressors in their life. And then we also asked them again about their on and offline exposure to radicalizing or extremist content. Right. Yes, and then we also, so our main outcome variable is the hate behavior scale, was developed by Matteo Vergani, who might be in the audience, I'm not sure. He's based at Deakin University. And what the scale does, it is like a newly developed and validated instrument, which can be used for quantitative research in order to assess hate against different outgroups. Here we specifically focus on Muslims, and also within the talk. So the paper also talks about the nonviolent behaviors, but here within the talk, because it is already a lot of analyses, I'm only focusing on the 2 different types of violent outcomes. And the scale is like a multi-level scale, so a multi-dimensional scale, sorry, it has 3 different components or dimensions. So it has discrimination, defensive violence, and belligerent violence. And we're focusing on the 2 violent outcomes for this talk, but I'm happy to talk about the other component as well and tell you about the findings. The sample, was an Australian, was an American online survey, that's wrong. It was conducted by YouGov, 1,600 people. We almost had like equal gender split, and it was representative for the adult population based on gender, age, race, and education. Most of the participants, 70% were white, and then you can also see the other percentages. 5 minutes, or I can't see it?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Good, I saw that. Right. I think I can do this in 5 minutes. So yeah, just to show you the results here. They might look relatively similar to yesterday. This is like kind of a main or core component of our research, looking at the interaction of different types of risk factors, because we know these relationships are so complex. It's never just one factor. It's probably a lot more factors, but we can only model so many in one analysis. So for example, when people have like, you can see here the 2 different outcomes, belligerent anti-Muslim violence and defensive anti-Muslim violence. And you can see that amongst those people who have high levels of perceived threats, and they have high legal cynicism, so they think it's okay to break the rules and norms and law. They have a significantly higher risk towards engagement in both types of violent behaviors. We can also see with the bottom light blue line that when people are low in legal cynicism, so when they say it's not okay to break the rules, then this risk is lessened or dampened. So in that respect, we can say that having kind of a low legal cynicism or low levels of legal cynicism in that specific case acts as an interactive buffering protective factor. very long word, sorry. When we look at low self-control, we see very similar results, but we see quite a lot stronger results when we look at belligerent anti-Muslim violence. So we can see that particularly amongst those people who have low self-control, which is like the top blue line, we can see that there is a significantly increased risk towards anti-Muslim violence. However, we can see that having high levels of self-control can dampen the risk effects. We also measured individual self-reported violent and criminal behaviors, and then we created a sum score. So we looked at those people who have reported more engagement in different types of violent criminal behaviors. And here we can see, so we see that both interactions are significant, but we can see that the effects for defensive anti-Muslim violence is quite weak. It was still significant, but we found a weak interaction effect. However, when we looked at belligerent violence, we could see that especially those people who have that violent criminal propensity are significantly more likely, when they also have threat perceptions, to say they would be willing to engage in violence against Muslims. And to speak quickly about the situational domain, here we measured people's proximal crises. So again, as I said, within the last 12 months, have you experienced certain stresses, crises in your life? We could also see that it was significant for both types of outcomes, but specifically, I see it. Thanks, Michelle. Yeah. But specifically, again, for belligerent violence, we saw that having more recent stressors increase the risks of threat perception. And the very last result, I'm sorry I'm rushing, I'm happy to tell you more about it in the Q&A. So when we looked at extremist exposure, it was again striking that, especially for belligerent anti-Muslim violence, we found the strongest effect. So those people who said they were exposed to extremist material on or offline were significantly more likely to say they would engage in anti-Muslim violence, especially when they had perceived threats. We saw that this was weaker, but still significant when we looked at defensive violence. And just to wrap up, so we see here in our analysis that the risk of grievance-fuelled violence, here in our case targeting Muslims, emerges from the interaction of processes at different levels. This also makes clear that we have to look at the functional roles and relevance of risk and protective factors. So it's not just that a risk factor might be relevant for all people. So we really have to look, it will be context dependent, and it will be dependent on other factors being present or absent. And I mean, we all know it's the $1 million question to answer, who will actually mobilize to violence. We still don't know it, and I don't think we'll ever find it out. But we might get a step closer in kind of finding certain factors which might amplify the risk or which might increase the risk. But as I also mentioned yesterday, it's very important that we not just look at cross-sectional data, but that we really move on to the developmental trajectories and see how these risk and protective factors, together with like the threat perceptions and intentions to engage in violence, how they co-develop over time, if certain things go up or down together. And I think from like longitudinal data, we can learn a lot more than we can learn from cross-sectional. However, this was based on cross-sectional data. We've also run it all for the non-violent behaviors. So I'm more than happy to talk about this later, but it was just too much for today. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to take questions later.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Bettina.
Thank you.
I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions at the end. So moving right through to our next presenter, it is my pleasure now to, as I turn my page, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Kurt Braddock from American University. Welcome back to the AVERT Symposium, Kurt. Kurt is going to be speaking to us today about trends in demographic, psychological, criminological, and societal factors using deep learning neural networks to gauge risk for violent and non-violent extremist behaviors. Over to you, Kurt.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your patience in me going online, offline, online. Literally 5 minutes ago, the power in my house just decided to go out. So if it disappears again, it might be the apocalypse in the mid-Atlantic of the East Coast of the US. So I apologize. In any event, there's quite a bit to get through, so please allow me to jump right into this project. And let me talk a bit about my background first in terms of what motivated this project. Those of you that know my work know that I'm a communication guy, and I'm really interested in communication phenomena. But last summer, I was certified at Cornell University in data science, and one element of that certification was neural networks. And it struck me that neural networks could be brought to bear on the prediction of different kinds of outcomes in the study of violent extremism. And we've seen a little bit of it. I've seen neural network work or be used to identify weak targets, things like what countries might be more susceptible to terrorist attack than others. But being a social scientific communication guy, I'm more interested in kind of individual level factors. So I'll get into the methods in a bit. But using an individual level database, that being the PIRIS database for all of its strengths and weaknesses, I used that data to identify different variables that predicted whether somebody engaged in extremist behavior that was violent or nonviolent. Before jumping into the actual neural network element, let me give a little bit of a recap as to why I used the PIRIS database. As we know, there are different levels of factors that influence whether somebody engages in extremist activity at all, and then what kind of role they choose when they are involved in extremist activity. Without going through all the different theoretical perspectives in relation to radicalization to violence or radicalization to nonviolent activity, the old model by Taylor and Horgan, I think, it shows it best originally that we have these individual level factors, group level factors, and structural factors. And by understanding them in concert and looking at how they interact with one another, we can get a better idea, or at least develop models that might predict the kind of behaviors that people engage in once they're involved with an extremist group. So to distinguish the kind of outcomes, violent versus nonviolent, outcomes that people are engaged in when they're involved with an extremist group, we need methods for doing so. And we have a couple of them. We can use logistic regression analyses and cluster analyses, but I wanted to bring my new data science background to bear. So I tried my hand at using neural networks, specifically algorithms in neural networks that are able to distinguish outcomes, whether something is present or absent. So before I jump into the data itself, let me talk about neural networks very briefly. You're going to get 8 weeks of neural network training in about 4 minutes. So if there are questions afterward or beyond this, I'm happy to take them. Essentially, a deep learning neural network, or the use of neural networks, they're what's called an unsupervised learning method, meaning the data that are input into the networks they don't have any presuppositions about them. We put them in just as numbers, and we don't tell the model what to expect from them. So we can use unsupervised learning methods to identify patterns in data that we don't really have any assumptions about. They're comprised of what's called an input layer, which more or less correlates or is meant to be where you put your independent predictors. You have hidden layers where the algorithms are used to transform the data that are put into the input layer. And then we have the output layer, which is the dependent variable in your analysis. So on the left, this is a sample of a very simple neural network where we'd have 3 predictors. We assign different weights. If you see W1, W2, W3, we assign different weights arbitrarily to those paths. The numbers that are put into the independent predictors in the input layer then are transformed in the hidden layer, so nodes A and B. We're going to ignore node S for now. You can ask about that if you're interested later. And then the output goes to that output layer, the dependent variable. The model then compares what the model predicted with the actual value using testing data, and then it adjusts the weight of those different paths until you minimize the expected value and the observed value of the outcome. And then you can put data into the input layers and give you an output layer where you don't know what the outcome is supposed to be. So I'm not going to go through all of these for the sake of time bit by bit, but essentially there are 5 different kinds of what we call activation functions that can be used in those computation nodes in the hidden layers. So it depends on the research question you want to ask. Because I was interested in the presence or absence of violence, the variable is defined in the Pyrrhus data set as whether the person was violent or not in their activity, I wanted to use either the logistic activation function, which transforms the variable to a zero or a number between 0 and 1, whether the variable is close to being absent or close to being present, or the hyperbolic tangent activation function, which you see there in node A. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That's the logistic activation function. But logistic activation function and the hyperbolic tangent activation function, those are the ones you want to use if you want to know whether a outcome is likely or not likely. So for me, whether somebody engaged in violence or not was the outcome I was interested in. These are the different kinds of formulas you can use as activation functions. The value of the output you're given and why that output is useful. As you can see, the hyperbolic tangent activation function predicts the absence or the presence of an outcome in the same way that the logistic function does, but the particular the particular analysis software I use only has the hyperbolic tangent function, so I went ahead and used that. So with that said, I just gave you 8 weeks and, like I said, about 4 or 5 minutes. Let's talk about the specific model that I built and developed. So as I said, I used the Pyrrhus data set from start with an N of 3,203. There are, I believe, 88 predictors in the data set itself, but many of those predictors are nominal or ordinal in kind, and you can't put those into neural networks. So I had to transform different variables with multiple levels into that level being present or that level being absent. So eventually I ended up with 337 different predictors in this particular data set. And then one outcome variable. Was the extremist activity the person was implicated in, was it violent or was it nonviolent activity? So the network model that I used was comprised of 337 input nodes. Remember, that's that left side where you put the input variables. And then you can run an a priori algorithm that shows what the best structure of your neural network is supposed to be. And I can talk to you about the code for that and that particular algorithm. But for the purposes of brevity, the structure that was optimal for my data, it looks like it had two different hidden layers with 4 processing nodes. I used 70% of the cases to train the model, meaning the model knew what the outcome was, whether it was 1 or 0, and then optimized the model based on how close it predicted whether a person was violent or not. And then I tested the model with 30% of the data. So after I optimized the model and trained it, and it figured out what the best weights for those paths were, you then take 30% of the data and don't tell it what the outcome is supposed to be. And then you compare what it predicts against the actual data to see how accurate that model is. So this is what the neural network looks like that I used. On the left, there would be 100 or 337 input nodes, but nobody wants to look at a slide like that. So just pretend there were 337 input nodes. And then I assigned different values to all of the paths, ran it with 70% of the data, and allowed it to minimize the error between observed and expected values for the violent, meaning a person was violent or not. It ran 70% of the data and minimized the error between observed and expected values for that subset, and then took the remaining 30%, did not assume a value for violent, and then I compared what it predicted versus what the actual outcome was. So what does this all mean? These numbers, if you're not familiar with neural networks, does that say 5, Michelle?
It does say 5. Thanks, Kurt. Okay,
no problem. You can ignore the top table. I can go through what those mean if you like, but essentially lower log loss is better, higher AUC is better, a higher Gini is better, and R squared is what we all know. That's the percent of the outcome variable or variance in the outcome variable that can be explained by the model. So a very high R squared value. But what'll make more sense intuitively is that bottom table where you look to see when we took the 30% of the values, I ran 10 iterations of it. So I ran the model 10 times. And across those 10 models, the average accuracy for the model is about 94%. So after the model was optimized and I didn't tell it whether somebody was violent or not, about 94% of the time, it correctly predicted whether an observation had engaged in violent or non-violent activity. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to talk about these one by one, but you can go through and the algorithms can tell you what the most important variables are to explain the variance in that outcome. And these are presented in level of importance. So the most important variable was consistently whether or not there was an identifiable coherent plot that somebody was involved with. If they weren't involved with a coherent plot, then they were more likely to engage in nonviolent activity, which makes sense. Anytime you see a plus there, that means that there's a positive relationship between that variable and whether somebody was violent, and negative would be an inverse relationship. A note about ideology. A significant portion of the PIRIS data set for the Islamic subset was related to ISIS fighters, and most of those ISIS fighters were violent in kind. So there's a bit of a skew in the data here where Islamic ideology is a bit overrepresented. Islamic ideology and violent outcomes were a bit collinear. So that positive outcome, we don't want to read too much into the fact that Islam is associated with violence. That's not the case. It's just a function of the data. Now, what does this all mean? Number one, it looks like we can couple or we can put neural networks in with logistic regression and other kinds of distinguishing algorithms and methods to disaggregating outcomes associated with violent extremism and terrorism. Here, the model I used, even though it was preliminary, was 94% accurate, which I was pretty happy with. But as always, this is, as one reviewer put it, a methodological exercise, which I agree with. So we have to be careful when we use these neural networks, especially in the preliminary use of them, as we kind of test to see how useful they are, not drawing too many conclusions about cultural or ethnic background, because there are problems with the data that can be 2 minutes, Michelle?
That's the one.
Okay, cool. There are problems with the data that we need to take into account when we interpret the outcomes. Here, I'm most concerned with the fact that ideology was associated with violent versus nonviolent. We would need to take a more nuanced look at the data and recognize that the Islamic ideology element was more or less collinear with ISIS, which itself was collinear with violent outcomes. So this is all to say that just like with any other kind of method, we need to be aware of the data that we're using to make reasonable or draw reasonable conclusions about our outcomes and the output. I feel that because using R and doing neural networks, this has huge big data implications, because the processing power needed to run large amounts of data is comparatively small in using neural networks. If you have a significant amount of data, anybody who's used SPSS and tried to do big data knows it can crash relatively easily. So I think that using neural networks, when we have thousands of predictors and thousands of different observations, it can be very useful for that as well. But I would say that I think that these models need to be tested on more specific kinds of data. As a communication guy, like I said, I'd be curious to look at things beyond demographics, socioeconomics, and look at things like media consumption, messages people are exposed to, their family, their friends, communication level variables, to draw more nuanced conclusions about what contributes to radicalization, to violence versus nonviolence. So I think I made it under 15 minutes. So with that, I'll leave it there, and I will look forward to your questions after our final presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kurt. And you absolutely did come in bang on time. So thank you so much for that.
It was great. I was trying my best.
Well done. Our last speaker in this session, we are both delighted and fortunate to have with us in person. And that is Dr. Emma Belton from Griffith University, who is going to be speaking to us on linking conspiracy beliefs with violence, a scoping review of the empirical literature. And we're thrilled to have you, Emma. Over to you.
I have to say, I feel very lonely this morning. Thanks, guys, online for that. Actually, Kurt, you gave me a really great segue into some news I wanted to share with everyone. So today I am going to be talking about conspiracy beliefs and their link to violence, but a lot of my work that I do is looking at, similar to what Kurt did, that distinction between violent and non-violent offending. And yesterday I was lucky enough to be offered a contract by Routledge to So I'm very excited about that. But in the interest of moving forward, which I can't do, is there a way that I should be?
You want that on the screen?
No presentation slides. I could talk to that for 15 minutes. I'll give it a go.
I'll go check with Bettina your slides.
Okay, I'll start. So the reason we decided to do so, this work was conducted by under an ARC project with Griffith University. And so I'm not, as I said, conspiracy theorist expert. So if you have any conspiracy related questions, I would implore you to talk to my colleague and dear friend Bettina, because that is definitely her area. So we wanted to see, based on all the uprisings and the recent terrorist attacks that seem to be related to this huge emergence of conspiracy beliefs, especially post-COVID. And what we wanted to find out was, what's the actual empirical link between those that believe in conspiracy theories and does that actually lead to violence? And what's the functional role of conspiracy beliefs in violence? So that was the sort of reasoning behind why we wanted to do a scoping review. And I will never, ever do one of these again. So there was actually only 3 of us.
Okay.
Hey, that conducted this, and they are quite laborious, even though they're not. It wasn't a systematic review.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So I think I'll move past that. Essentially, what we wanted to look at was actually the link between conspiracy beliefs and violent extremism. And so we know there was a lot of terrorist attacks in 2020 that were conducted or executed by known conspiracy theorists. We know from previous research that conspiracy narratives are deeply embedded within extremist ideologies, extremist groups, and early research also talks about its function as a radicalization multiplier. So we think there's some sort of functional role that conspiracy beliefs play in the execution or leading to violence. And we know from a lot of terrorist manifesto analysis that they do refer to conspiracy theories quite frequently. What we don't know, which is what I said before, is what is the relationship, what does it look like, and what evidence actually exists. So we endeavoured to, about a year ago, conduct a preliminary assessment on the extent and scope and nature of the current evidence base. Based on, we don't think there's any existing reviews that look at this specifically, and we were looking at quantitative data or studies that utilize quantitative methods only. And the reason for that is we wanted to look at specifically the extent of the relationship, how often it was measured, the directional relationship between these two concepts. So we thought following a sort of systematic scoping review was the best protocol for doing that. I'm not going to go through methods because I do not have the time. But I will tell you that these were the research questions that guided the research. So as I said, we looked at the extent of the relationship. Does it exist? And what is the strength of that? Now, keep in mind, we did not conduct a meta-analysis, which is obviously a more rigorous way of doing that. But we wanted to get a sort of generalized, summarized sense of the strength. And we wanted to know, is there evidence that conspiracy beliefs actually precede violence? And then that also would allow us to talk about the existing gaps, which could then lead to future research endeavours. As I said, the main concept was conspiracy beliefs. We did not put any limitations on the types of conspiracy beliefs, so whether that's conspiracy mentality, so the predisposition to believe in conspiracies, or whether that was something more specific like those espoused by QAnon believers or COVID-related conspiracies. So we didn't put any limitations on that. The outcome measure was obviously violence. Now, we were looking at extremist violence, but for the sake of looking at the extent of the literature, we sort of opened that up to any types of violence because of the way extremist violence is operationalized in research. We know that the definitions and terminology has changed over the years. Some people refer to it as political, other ideological. You know this. Everyone in this room knows this. And so we included both attitudinal and behavioural measures. Very briefly, I'll touch on this. We only included peer-reviewed journals and books, and those published between 2000 and 2023, the end of October. Only in English, no geographical limits. And as I said, we only looked at quantitative research methods. And if we have questions about that, I'm happy to answer. and we looked at the individual levels, units of analysis. Search strategy, I did an initial search to have a look at what was out there. There's not much, as I'm sure a lot of you are not surprised by, as it's more of a recent emergence, especially in the research field. And we can talk more about methods later, but in the interest of time. The initial search pulled about 2,000 records, and then by the time we weaned all through that, through first and second stage screening, which was done by myself and my 2 co-authors, there was 25 publications left that were included in the review. So let's talk about those. Not surprisingly, a lot of the articles came from very different areas. As we know, this area, even terrorism, draws on a lot of different fields: criminology, psychology, political science. So there was a very big dispersion of where the research had been conducted, and that includes where they were published and, you know, the merits of the publications and all of that. But that was typically where they were found, in these sort of major domains. There was 23 peer-reviewed journal articles, 1 was a preprint and 1 was a book. Most of these, as I said, unsurprisingly, were published post-2020, so sort of after COVID era. And they were only conducted in developed countries. So most of the studies drew on survey data, so cross-sectional data. And again, Bettina talked about that before, the use of that. And they looked at a lot of attitudinal measures. Sample sizes ranged, and only 2 studies from all of the publications actually looked at involvement in violence in behaviour. So they drew on open source terrorist offender databases, which actually Kurt talked about just before. So Pyrus was one of them, and the ECDB was the other one. Study measures. So when we were collecting all of this, it was very hard to get some consistency across them because they came from so many different areas and drew on so many different measures. We didn't actually put any limitations on the directions of whether conspiracy beliefs led to violence or vice versa, just so that we're including everything. So essentially 21% of the studies used conspiracy beliefs as their explanatory variable. So it explained violence, or it was argued that it would explain violence. 4 actually used violence as the explanatory variable and conspiracy beliefs as the dependent variable. And I will say, Siobhan, I know you talked about a study yesterday that looked at the link between conspiracy beliefs and support for violence, and I'm very sorry I didn't include it. But so as we can see, it's a very emerging field, which is why we wanted to figure out where is the evidence base at. So within those 25 publications, there was actually 33 unique studies. So, you know, when people conduct studies, they're like, I'm going to put 2 studies into the one publication. So that made things even more confusing when we were trying to put all these together. Most used cross-sectional. There were 7 experiments. Only 1 study used longitudinal data. And as I said, 2 of them used offender databases. Analysis essentially was mostly bivariates and regression, so looking at the relationship between these 2 things. A couple of did structural equation modeling. The 2 studies that actually used offender data, which I think is important to note, only drew on inferential statistics to make their conclusions, right? So we have to be very cautious about what we say about those studies based on the analysis used. This is a very, so I can't tell you how many tables we made, remade, changed, amended, but essentially what you can see here is all of the publications that were included, the number of studies within each of the publications that were conducted, and then those plus and minuses there are looking at the significant relationships that were found. So following that, you've got the types of conspiracy beliefs. So when we were trying to make sense of all of this, we tried to make these categories of the types of conspiracy beliefs. So you've got general conspiracy beliefs, which is looking at that conspiracy mentality, so that predisposition, and they use a lot of scales to measure that. Then there's specific, where studies drew on very context-specific conspiracy theories like New World Order or the Great Replacement Theory. There were other studies that looked at COVID-19 conspiracies specifically, and then another group again that looked at QAnon conspiracies. I'll talk a bit more about these as you go, but I just wanted to give you an example of what a mess this was. The outcomes for violence were measured as support, justification, intentions, or behaviour. And we found there was 3 categories of violence that studies typically focused on. So it was either general violence, so sort of criminally involved violence with no real ideological or political motivation. And then we had political violence and extremist violence. And something I should note about that actually before someone bites my head off. We know that the use of political and extremist violence can sometimes happen concurrently, especially in the literature. There was reasons we decided to separate these two, and it was generally based on the measures and the way that the authors would operationalize the type of violence. So for us, extremist violence had to be driven or motivated by an ideology and was usually related to radicalization in some way. Political violence, on the other hand, didn't necessarily have to have an ideological motivation. So we thought it was important to separate and make that distinction for the purpose of this. Most studies measured political violence and then followed by extremist violence, and very few looked at actual violence that was essentially just general in nature for no real reason. Those that did measure extremist violence, thank you, typically used attitudinal measures. So they looked at the scales, they used scales that have been validated in the field and often looked at intentions for extremist violence. But it is important to note that of the two studies that used offender data, both of those were extremist offender databases. So most studies looked at general conspiracy ideation and linked that with a sort of a different type of violence. And then followed by that, specific ones, QAnon or COVID-19, right? So most studies, as I said, they looked at attitudinal measures. So the majority, and a lot of these studies also would sometimes measure two types of violence, which made it, again, even more confusing. So they would have a measure for support for violence, and then they would also use a measure for intentions for violence. And in the interest of time, I'm going to move through this. So generally, what did we find out of all of these studies? The evidence, or the statistical evidence, I should say, is relatively weak or clustered into the weak, very weak. So you can see there that, 50% of the associations that were found, though they were significant, they were quite weak. And so that was quite interesting to us. The other thing we sort of looked at was the types of violence and the strength of those relationships with conspiracy beliefs. So, was general violence more likely to be related? And we typically found that actually extremist violence was one of the main sort of category that was found to have the strongest relationships. The rest kind of clustered into that weak to very weak area. A lot of these studies as well, and we thought it was important to point this out because we wanted to look at that functional role. So as actually Bettina said before, we're looking at how there's different factors and they intersect and they interrelate and they occur at different times. And so a lot of these studies looked at the role of conspiracy beliefs and whether they explained a relationship between two other variables or whether they exacerbated the relationship. So a lot of them looked at things like psychological distress and self-efficacy and legal cynicism. And they actually found that that conspiracy beliefs, these variables actually exacerbated the relationship, right? So there seems to be something else going on, and there's maybe not as a direct relationship as some might believe or think. The other thing that we found was quite interesting is that there was a lot of other risk factors that actually explain the relationship between someone believing in conspiracies and then movement towards violence. And these were very attitudinal in nature, negative attitudes like anger and envy and symbolic threat, which we see a lot in the extremist literature, that are really important risk factors for that movement to radicalization and violent extremism. So lastly, I hate the word causation or causal because, let's be honest, we can't really determine causation unless we're using longitudinal data, and even then. But for the purpose of this, we wanted to give a general sense of how the studies fared that way. So only 24% could actually measure or actually investigate some sort of preliminary causal relationship between these two things. 4 of them confirmed it. The rest were inconclusive or partially supportive. And the one study that actually did use longitudinal data to measure how conspiracy beliefs at time 1 and time 2 have changed over time and their relationship with violence, that was only really partially supported. So what does all this mean? Is there a relationship between these two things? Yes, we think so. The evidence seems to suggest that, although the evidence is quite weak. And so it's quite inconclusive on their role, the role between believing in conspiracies and involvement in violence. A lot of the studies use attitudinal measures, and we know that believing or supporting violence doesn't necessarily mean someone's going to go actually engage in violence. So that is also a limitation here. The causal evidence was very preliminary. So we need to draw on more experimental studies, more longitudinal data to essentially confirm or disconfirm these early findings. That's it for me. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, well, we have had 4 absolutely fascinating and informative presentations. I'm sure that people have a lot of questions, and of course, we do have time for questions now. And Lydia has the microphone, and we'll be roving for those of you who want to put your hand up. But look, while people are gathering their thoughts, I might kick off with a question for Bettina. So Bettina, look, thank you again for a really wonderful and insightful presentation. It's very exciting work. In your conceptual framework, in your propensity column, I'm curious about the difference that things like your focus on executive function capacity, also, what difference does that make for young people, and also the rule breaking? Okay, so the moral rule breaking. So young people's brains are still developing, and that means their executive function capacity is still developing. We know that adolescence is also a time where you might say that rule breaking, including forms of moral rule breaking, is actually age appropriate as teenagers test boundaries. So I'm just curious to hear a little bit more from you around what the implications of your conceptual framework are for application to young people.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. I actually ran the study also looking at younger people. So we only looked at those from 18 to 25. And what we've seen, so the moderating effects of both are like legal cynicism, so it's okay to break the rule, and law, as well as self-control, were significantly stronger for young people. So, I mean, these effects massively spiked. So when young individuals had these perceptions and they had low self-control or high legal cynicism, then we saw by far like a higher risk towards engagement in violence. So we know from our developmental data, so worked with people based in Zurich and the University of Cambridge. They have a longitudinal data set where kids start age 6, 7, and now they are like 25. So we have about 9 waves now. They measured self-control as well as extremist attitude through the adolescence. What we see, self-control peaks around 14, 15 already. It already goes down then. What we've seen as well is that our extremist attitudes also go down at that age. I mean, that doesn't mean that the self-control causes whatever or the other way around. But I mean, we do see that it comes down and we do see that it peaks. And when we look at our data and at least look at the younger cohorts, we see that these effects are much stronger. So I guess when looking at youth mobilization, we have to, and we are just starting a project here in the US on that. We really have to see whether the same kind of risk and moderating risk and protective factors apply to young people, because we do know their brains do develop, and it's such a transitional phase as well. So certain proximal stressors as well might affect younger children or like younger adolescents a lot more than adults, just because your identity isn't formed yet and you're just a lot more susceptible. So yes, we know that the ones we could measure were significantly stronger, the effect for younger people, but we expect there's a lot more. So we are actually going to do a lot more data collection on this. And yeah, I mean, great question. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Okay, other questions, thoughts for any of our presenters? Don't be shy. Yes, up the back there.
Thank you. This is a question for Astrid. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about what the types of leaking behaviours or indicators that you observed in the risk assessment tool are, like examples of those things.
Yes, of course. Thank you for your question. So it is developed by somebody else, by two researchers in Germany. So I can't speak freely about these factors, as I'm sure, yeah, we can all appreciate the sensitivity of these things. But I can say that so leaking behavior in general, what it is really these behaviors, right? So they don't have to be necessarily super related to the attack planning, but they can be. So trying to purchase a weapon, for example, is one of them. Or asking somebody how to make a bomb would be leaking, and like they're trying to acquire a weapon is something that we can observe. So that's the really important thing, that we can observe it. So if it happens in a diary, for example, then it's not leaking behavior. And then behaviors that are not specifically related to attack planning could also be posting, like just showing, for example, that you do have weapons. So posting a picture with a gun, for example, could be one of the leaking signals as well. And so the amount of leaking signals in general is just unlimited. But for this instrument, it was found that 14 of these really predicted who was planning something and who was not. So they were able to really specifically narrow it down when a behavior was and was not predictive of behavior. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Astrid. We've got a question over here.
Hi, Astrid. Another question for you. Really great presentation. I was just wondering if you can talk to how your tool would get used by end users, especially in, sorry, I'm losing my voice, in the context that structured professional judgment is seen as standard practice within the space. Obviously, your tool provides a really great structure to the approach, but how much leeway does it give to the judgment of the professional?
So I think right now the tool gives more of a categorization or a numerical outcome, but I think when SPG wants to be adhered to, then you could also really embed the tool in a way that you don't get to see this outcome or this calculation that it gives you. And I also think that it's clear that no tool should be used on its own, right? So I think this one would be really good in informing somebody when making these kind of assessments. But yeah, like the way that I presented it in the slides is also like very like strict, like, okay, high risk, low or moderate risk, and intervention, no intervention. But of course, like there's a lot of middle ground there where, maybe we don't intervene, but we keep supervising we keep measure, our intelligence in place. So I think, this is the way that it can be embedded in practice by end users, and it is being being applied in Germany right now. So studies are on the way where police tries to use this instrument as well in real life. So I think we'll know more about that soon.
Okay, terrific. Thank you very much. Now, look, we are unfortunately out of time and certainly don't want to stand between you and lunch, but we've had 4 amazing presentations. Could you give a big round of applause to everybody? Thank you so much to our 3 online presenters, as well as our in-person presenter for joining us today, and see everybody in 1 hour after lunch. Cheers. I don't know what's coming next. You tell them. Oh, sorry. And we have a wonderful discussion session coming up, which is going to be facilitated by the inimitable Kelly Michelle. So be prepared for that when we return. Thank you.
Bye.